a Washington, D.C. book group decided to read it. They recently discussed what's changed in America since the book was written and how relevant it is today. The group moderator is Michael Corbin of Politics and Prose Bookstore.
Last time we did Richard Sennett's book, The Personal Consequences of Work in the New Capitalism. We had, I think, a fairly good discussion about what it means to not only be a worker here at the end of the 20th century, but what kinds of personal virtues we hold, what kinds of labor give us satisfaction in life. And we chose for this time John Kenneth Galbraith's The Affluent Society. It's the 40th anniversary edition, book that originally appeared in 1958, that I think has both some historical value, I mean, as a historical document of the time, but also some relevance for today. Again, I'm Michael. I work here at Politics and Prose. Why don't we go around one time, just so when we have our conversation, we can refer to each other by name if we remember them.
I'm Helen. I work at the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
I'm Lisa Yarconi.
I'm Eleanor Grass.
I'm Ray Donnelly.
Bill Herman.
Lee Frazier.
Norma Schulman.
Alyssa Leaf.
So, thanks for coming, guys. As I talked to the staff about Affluent Society, there was clearly a generational divide in both the recognition and acknowledgement of the choice. There's some older staff, including Barbara and Carla, the owners, who were like, oh, that's great. You know, I remember reading that in graduate school. Some of the younger staff were like, John Kenneth Galbraith, Affluent Society, what is that? So I think that's another interesting take on this book, that it is and was a classic, but perhaps not so notable to a younger audience. So, our so-called Dow Jones average has reached some new level of 10,000. Our wayward president tells us of the increasing number of months we are in the post-war expansion without a recession. I think it's arguable in Galbraith's language that we have in fact achieved the affluent society of some sort anyway. So I think it is a relevant text for the times. What did the rest of you feel about it generally before we get into more concrete specifics?
One question I had is that, how well do you think it's aged since 1958? I mean, according to his own statement, maybe economic tracks should have a narrow lifespan, and in fact, he defends Marx on that grounds that, well, you know, for his time, things came true, so let's quit trying to hold him to something beyond what he was stating. And if you looked at the foreword, matter of fact, he says, I've quietly dropped out parts of this book that no longer apply.
He also says he mostly stands by what he says. Well, what do you think? Obviously, you have maybe some disagreement that it still stands. But you're right. In the first several chapters, when he talks about this tradition, he is talking about how well economic theorists fare as theorists, as sort of writers about the aims of man and how sort of dated they can easily be.
Well, we were talking before, and I thought there was something that was kind of interesting about the fact that he said in the introduction, he says, nothing, for example, gives me more pleasure than the chapter on the concept of the conventional wisdom, which has now passed into the language. So without a pin or irony, he says, you know, my concept of conventional wisdom is now conventional wisdom. So that was kind of interesting.
He seems to have a very sort of superior attitude towards economists in general, because I mean the whole thrust of the book, which I may be right, you know, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but you know the whole thrust of the book is that economics are built on, you know, some 18th century ideas about productivity, which have been perpetuated ad nauseum to the point where they are no longer applicable. And you know, I wonder about that. Are economists so mired in the past? That was
So you see the sort of polemical style as sort of problematic.
Well, I wish I had a little more background, if I could know if this is actually true.
Right. Well, he does write to a general reader here, I think, both to a specialist
Yeah,
and a
I
general
mean, just,
reader.
I mean, but the whole point he's making throughout the book is that we are building on Ricardo, and it's never
Right.
going away.
Right.
That productivity is good, even if
Okay.
productivity never doesn't serve a function.
Right.
And it's spinning its own wheels and creating demand so it can fulfill it.
Right.
People are just mired in this
Right.
200-year-old idea, and I'm wondering if that's true or not.
So well,
Well,
you're
it
suggesting...
seems to make sense that the vested interest would encourage the proliferation of production.
Doesn't
Doesn't it?
In terms of his discussion of economists in general, I don't think what he's saying, is that it's vested interests that are feeding this, that economists are in cahoots with producers. What he's saying is that this is just an idea that's survived.
I meant the
because it's-
vested interests in society that are, able
he
to
says-
engineer the.
Well, but so you're saying you don't buy it on its face that this belief, he says we're enthralled to this productive idea.
Yeah, I mean,
So you don't buy that on its
yeah,
face. Or at least you question it.
I question it, that all theorists are so...
Right.
Because he's not saying they're in cahoots with producers and it's a bit of vested interest in society. That's not what he says. What he's saying is they have this idea that they picked up from Ricardo, and it's worked its way in economic theory, and it's never gone away.
Well, what do the rest of you
No
think?
question.
I mean, because I think one of the issues here is the degree to which conventional wisdom is the conventional wisdom of the economists, or is it the conventional wisdom of our politicians? Is it our conventional wisdom
Well,
as
that was
Well, I
Problem
citizens?
think that's some of what we're talking about is simply a stylism on his part. He's not. Personally, I think it would be an error to attribute to him disdain to other economists. What he has is more comic disdain for the rest of the human race, which is
Good
evident
point.
in the rest of his books. I think that he's and in that regard, I think he's a pleasure to read. I mean, he's funny. He's enjoyable. He's pungent in a lot of ways, and I think that's his only point there.
Just as a point of style there, did the rest of you feel that it was written to a general readership? So I think one of the things that we do have is this poverty of sort of an economic vocabulary, a shared economic vocabulary. I mean, how many of you look at the business pages, and if you do you look at it beyond like the first couple of pages? Do you look at all the sort of cryptic hieroglyphics sort of to explain our economic health? Or you listen to our politicians, and they have some rhetoric about the economy. But I don't know that we actually share economic ideas. And I think one of the things that's great about Galbraith for a public audience is that he's attempting to at least give us a vocabulary of economic ideas, so at least we can discuss them.
He explains that very well.
Yeah.
I mean, he explains it enough so he can build up to his point.
Right. Well, do the rest of you feel like, I mean, was there a diminishment for you of not being, I don't know, maybe some of you are economists, I don't know, but as just sort of members of the Republic, did you find it accessible?
Yes,
Yes.
definitely.
Yes.
But it
It
was
was too much so. It's almost,
Really?
It's almost as if so much of this is commonplace. Yeah, I read it 35 years ago.
You did?
Yeah, but tried to. I mean, in graduate school, it was really the sleepy text, like most economics. But so much of this seems to be almost premature, and if it was written in 1958, I mean, what do we know about production now? It's much more rational. We hadn't heard about operations research and the quantified approach to these things. I mean, the whole assumption of production was there, and I think it's even more so. I think people assume that employers can do pretty much what they want in the name of production, cost reduction,
Right.
cost efficiency. I think it's in the air. And I'm in a labor area, and I see it from that view.
Right. So is your criticism then as a book of 1958, or as a book that we're reading in 1998 that has that air for you?
It's a loving criticism.
Okay. I heard it as sympathetic.
Sure, in 1958, and it's going back and saying, by damn, he was right.
Okay.
Right.
And if he were starting off now, he probably would be even more acerbic and more pungent in his critique.
You're about to say.
Yeah, I thought it may even have been better issued now because the stuff, he's really describing kind of, you know, the economics that's undergirding what we're hearing from the politicians today. And in that point, I found it was really effective. And because it's a 40th anniversary edition, it made me feel even more like this thought is so outdated that, you know, I wrote this 40 years ago, and, you know, it just made you really feel like these politicians really haven't progressed, or the business people really haven't.
I know enough about economics to be suspicious when someone starts throwing out statistics, and so I know there was a study that came out fairly recently, like maybe within the past month, talking about how the distribution of wealth and distribution of income, and saying that you shouldn't necessarily look at just money. You should look at what that money is capable of buying, and it broke down, well, what percentage of households have television?
Right.
What percentage of households have VCRs? And when you start looking at economic distribution in those terms, the disparities are not quite so egregious. And
Right.
so I think maybe that's why.
Of course, there are problems with measures that use consumer goods as the stick to measure against.
Sure, I remember working in migrant camps in California years and years ago when, and there were televisions in almost every shack. I mean, this was before VCRs. You know, they didn't have the basics, but they had a few of the luxury.
And that was okay from their point of
Right.
view. That was something that they wanted. I thought one of the other things that's still very pertinent is his legitimization of inherited wealth. I mean, I don't think much has changed in 40 years on that. We still sort of accept that it's okay for it to be passed down in these huge quantities, generation after generation after generation. And we don't expect much back for it in terms of, do we expect these people to be leaders? Do we expect them to be more giving than the rest of us?
I think
More knowledgeable? We don't.
Sorry. I was going to say, I think that's true, and yet in a way I sort of feel like none of us has really mentioned the central point. Can you imagine the courage that it would take an economist to reissue a book after 40 years?
Right.
I mean, my Lord.
Well, let's get to that. I mean, towards the end here, he says, we are in one of the contexts where circumstances march far beyond conventional wisdom. And I think one of the tests of the relevance of the book, if one accepts it, is the relevance of his major point. Does someone want to sort of review his argument for general discussion?
As I started reading it, going to that point, has anyone, do you have the original?
Yeah.
Okay, 1958, because there were certain things he inserted in this text that clearly couldn't have been there. He mentions the remark by Nixon that we're all Keynesians now. Okay, he couldn't have said that in 1958.
Right.
Does anyone know to what extent this was revised, or did you see anything, what he pulled out, what he stuck back in?
Well, I think we'd have to do a close reading. I mean, he in his introduction and afterward, I think he hints that he revised the whole thing, but left major portions of it and excised some paragraphs and tweaked it, as it were, for the times, but left the major thrust of his argument.
One phrase here,
of the inflation issue, correct.
Accordingly,
Which
the
we should talk about.
price spiral is no longer a strongly motivating economic force. So there's less inflation even when employment is high. For some time as this is written, we have had low employment and little inflation, a circumstance much celebrated. This I did not foresee. I have quietly deleted some paragraphs that no longer apply.
Right. Well, but I mean, I think you can read that as sort of like hinting at larger sort of editorial things. I read it more as like I'm being open with you about what I did delete, and actually it's mostly as I wrote it in 1958. But you know, I mean, it's a
I was asking more as a point of information because the Nixon allusion also made me.
I think he did more than delete paragraphs. I think he added some stuff. I think there's some clear editorial updating.
So that might mitigate the courage factor.
Well, perhaps.
I think it is courageous. I think it's a good point.
But just as an economist, though, I mean, my heavens, an economic prediction.
Well, that
40
even
years
Galbraith can have the stature. I mean. There are very few intellectuals, contemporary intellectuals, I think, that sort of hold up well over time. I mean, sort of our intellectual pantheon. I don't know if maybe there are academics who are interesting. Surely the Sunday morning pundits don't rank as those who will probably stand the test of time. The George Wills of the world.
Who would you put in the intellectual pantheon? Without trying to put you on the spot.
Well, why don't we move to Galbraith?
Yeah, I was waiting for that.
So, and let's get to the thrust of his argument there. So there are these intellectuals that he says, I don't always agree with their ideas, but sees these intellectuals as great men.
I would like to add something. I think that the logic of the book itself almost cries for his own revisions, and let me sort of explain that.
Sure.
He's literally saying we all have a set of economic assumptions that really more or less drive our society. And then what he's saying is that some of them are just wrong. And
Well, but wrong in a particular way because...
or flawed because we're taught to think in
Ideological.
a certain way. Now, it would seem to me that you write a book like this, you throw it into the debate, you'd want to go back and see the degree to which you actually influence the debate if he's trying to change people's ideas and people's basic assumptions on how the economy works. So it seems to me there's
That's a
a
good
real
point.
logic in his doing this, and in fact he's done it several times.
No, you're right. You're right.
But I think
That's
that
a very good
also speaks to
observation.
his courage then, that he hasn't just sort of thrown it out there
His arrogance.
and let it go.
Some overlap there.
Well, I've
But there's also a certain irony there that his essential point is that people aren't changed in their framework of viewing the world by the introduction of new information.
Right, no, I think that the one chapter,
Right, that's a
especially
good
on the
point.
concept of conventional wisdom, I think that's going to hold up because that's the way human beings are. Is that, and will continue to be no matter
Yeah.
what. That's really not that's not an economic.
Sure. One always bristles
No,
at
not
those
as
theories
much
of
as
human nature that are tossed off too, though.
Oh,
but
I love that.
But okay, let's look at this notion then, just so we can maybe knock it down a little bit or set it up as a straw man. So there is this dismal science begun with Smith and Ricardo and Malthus, emended but not changed by Marx, that comes down to us that production is the necessary force to sort of overcome the general lot of men, which is immiseration and poverty. That is the poor you will always have with you kind of notion, and that both both in terms of a materialist history, this has been the case, and importantly for the discipline of social theory, specifically the economists, this notion is perpetuated over and over. However, at some point, and there are various ways to sort of pick the point, maybe 1958 or maybe now, we have this thing called the affluent society where production, sort of security, economic security is divorced from production. And yet we languish under these false notions of the need to continue to produce. So we produce goods, and then we actually have to produce the demand, to produce the desire for those goods. And that somehow this has become perverse. And that if we could get our heads around the fact that we no longer have scarcity, that we actually have affluence
On
and
average.
surplus,
Surplus.
on average, that we would then, from that would flow different policy considerations, perhaps a genuinely different society, a more balanced society, etc. So, what do you guys think?
I concur with him. I thought he was a genius then, and I think he's a genius now. And I don't think going against the mainstream is
Don't mince your words now.
is a mark of arrogance. I think it's a mark of competence, and he has the evidence to back his statements up. When he makes the point, and I haven't read the new, but I skimmed the old a little, and when he makes the point about the Russians having Sputnik, and it wasn't because they had a high or a low GDP, it was how they used their resources. Now, you know, it's another story that their genius mathematicians and physicists were doled out their daily bread and treated horribly. However, they still had the means and the genius was recognized. And now we're using the same little argument to say some rogue nation might get an atomic bomb, therefore we have to have 40 jillion whatevers floating around to shoot them down.
You're right. His critique, I think, of production is really, I think, profound still, that our military Keynesianism, that we want this military production, even though we're not, even when our steel mills are closing down, Our sort of blue-collar industries are now the Rust Belt, and yet we still produce weapons in outrageous proportion to their need.
And also, we
Here and
want to be
abroad.
careful about one thing. To be arrogant doesn't mean to be wrong.
Well, someone alluded to
But
that.
anyway,
We didn't say they were wrong. We just said
You can be
simply
both.
that
so this general premise then, I mean, like, you know, our
But I did want to finish.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
I wanted to compliment the part, and it's not that I don't believe in a strong military, it's just I would buy different weapons, as would some of the other people in the Armed Services Commission. But he also makes the point of when you don't have any food, someone doesn't have to tell you what you might need, whether it's a TV or a VCR or whatever. And he isn't even, I don't know if he got to the quality of our lives, you know, in terms of air that we can breathe and so forth. And we just have to have a different kind of focus of quality of life. And we are still, we meaning the society, is preoccupied with GDP, because it doesn't matter that some poor starving woman with 7 children she can't feed is sitting at a sewing machine for 15 hours a day with 1 bathroom break. That counts as production in X company, and we all know the names of the companies. Some of them we can try to avoid, and some things you pick up a label. I think the jacket I'm wearing, I could afford it, so
okay.
it's sewed in this country and woven in another country, and I don't have the time or the energy or the money to spend $700 for a jacket and say, is it all sewed by Americans and no one was enslaved to produce my jacket?
You make a good point, which it still dominates our politics. Whether we buy Galbraith's argument or not, I think it's self-evident that, you know, any political stump speech is going to say, I produced X number of jobs. Clinton is fond of saying this over and over. The Republicans will give the rejoinder of, well, productivity is up X percentage points, and we produced X number of cars from the car plants this year, or X number of computer chips or something like that. We regularly get headlines of the sort of downsizing, closing of factories as some sort of harbinger of economic decline, as opposed to, say, maybe a manifestation of a new kind of affluent society. I mean, I think we are, in fact, in his words, in thrall to this productive model. That, I mean, we find moral and ethical sustenance in believing that if we produce more, we'll be more economically secure.
But I think one point we haven't touched on, and I think is crucial to what he's talking about, is you're talking about private sector production. And what he claims is that public sector production is still production that we value in a very different way, and in fact, we value more. And I think one of the points, and I don't remember if he made this in here, is that we are starting to move more and more things into the private sector. And this has, but that may be that I'm maybe superimposing this.
I don't think that's what he says. I think what he says is we, again, going back to this point, I mean, he sees human beings as very stuck in the past. He goes back again to this business that about the public sector is, yes, it is production, and we should value it. However, going back again to the 18th century, which we see the state as intrusive, and the original function of going, in Ricardo's time again, the original function of the state was, to keep a little order and stay out of people's affairs, because otherwise it was going to
modern liberalism,
going to be oppressive. So we see the public production of the public sector, which should be valuable in providing education and clean streets, to keep up with private production of automobiles.
Right.
We're mistrustful of it because, again, we're stuck in the identity of the past. See, I mean, that's the one point of the book that bothers me, is he's got this sort of psychological thing that we are mired, in every way, and that our distrust of the state now goes back 200 years to when the state was oppressive rather than
Yeah, he seems to be stuck on the
efficient.
idea that we stay stuck on ideas.
Well, but I think he makes a materialist point, sort of acknowledging Marx, that it's not just a psychological model, that a new historical thing has come into being, probably post-World War II, where places like the United States and Europe have genuinely solved the problem of production, of scarcity, that we have enough to go around, as it were. And the interesting question is not whether we can produce, but how do we distribute this stuff, or how do we then imagine social goods in this new historical creation, the affluent society?
How much do you think the obsession with production, how much of that might be considered just the final playing out of the Enlightenment preoccupation with things that are quantifiable? Hey, you know, we have little formulas for doing.
There is a lot of that, because he says economists, his whole point is economists don't like things that are fuzzy. They have to measure things. We can't measure education, you know. We could. I mean, it does feed into good production. If you have good education, ultimately.
And if you start talking about other values, well, now how are we going to quantify, you know, how artistic we are as a nation? You know, there's no nice, neat little formula that we could put in a spreadsheet to quantify them, whereas these things, maybe people just resort to them because even if they don't think this is measuring anything absolute, it's an index of something else, and it is easily quantifiable.
No, well, I think it's a very good observation. That, I mean, modern liberalism is tied to sort of Enlightenment notions, a sort of progressive narrative, and that progressive narrative is about sort of measuring it. And maybe we are still enthralled to that as well.
Whether it's measurable or not.
Well, what would we measure? I mean, what do we, I mean, his epigram to begin the book of Alfred Marshall, the economist, like everyone else, must concern himself with the ultimate aims of man, as a kind of, I think, a sort of provocation. What in fact would we measure? It's easy to measure for Ricardo, for Malthus, for Marx. We measure the sort of growing disparities of wealth, inequality, the immiseration of our fellow human beings. But then if we're on the dismal side, we say tough, and that's the sort of lot of our fellow man. Or if we're sort of on the other side, we might hope for some utopian revolution to sort of solve these problems. But what would we measure now? What do we measure?
Well, if I were in charge, instead of just measuring the cars and the bombs and the TVs and the VCRs, I would also measure who's lining up to get a free meal. One doesn't do it in our neighborhood. We line up. I made the analogy to myself when Pepco failed us several summers ago, and there were hundreds of us in line at AU to get dry ice. And I was thinking, you know, I wouldn't wait in line, fortunately. I don't have to wait in line for a pound of cheese in the summer sun, but I was waiting in line because there was no place to get dry ice from than the people who caused us to need dry ice. So we were kind of captives there. And there are things that you could measure, but you can't, you don't need calculus for it, and you don't need models that were invented or created by
the
mathematicians.
food stamp lines, actually, and the demand for food stamps has declined recently, but they don't know what that means.
But because it's used on the same old model, and
I don't
remember, food stamps are sold.
I don't think this enables you to...
You and then here.
I don't think this enables us to escape from the ultimately qualitative or subjective nature of the measurement that one wants to make but may not be able to. If, for example, we follow out the logic of your point of looking to see if people are in lines, then very quickly we're going to have to confront what they are in lines for. It's one thing if they're in lines for the kind of cheese that you talked about, but another thing, again, if they're in line to get tickets to the Oscars. Those are societies in two very different places. What I'm driving at is I think that however reassuring it might be to force-fit reality into some measurable metric, that's an illusion. That, in fact, what we want to know is how satisfied people are with their existences.
It kind of relates well to, like, you know, there's this thing, the Human Development Report. I forget, you know, which international agency puts that out, but you know, in looking at different, you know, developing countries, the measures that they use are like things that really represent, you know, the kind of thing that, you know, ideally, like we would also want to represent, like, you know, like literacy rate or, you know, health status, you know, access to contraception, all those kind of things. And I think increasingly in the U.S. too, I've heard about some projects where different nonprofit organizations are trying to develop those kind of indicators, also for human development, in the United States. I don't know how big a trend it is. But another point that I was kind of interested in was like, how much emphasis there was in advertising and how that has changed things.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking that, like, what would the answer? I mean, if you're going to try to get this sort of social kind of or the public kind of issues on the table, to me, like, the only answer right now is that the private production is very well advertised. So what do you do? I mean, is the only thing that we can do just like advertise the public production, like have schools build into their budgets sort of advertisements to get the public to want to support it more? I mean, is that the only way to solve this, or is there another way? Or
One could argue that the Clinton era sort of spectacle of just constant advertising of himself might be a model of sort of that, but perhaps not a little more perverse than you were thinking about.
Yes. The thing, I enjoyed this book, and I did find it. The one problem I'm having, with this, he is making certain basic. Your dry ice example, it reminded me of something interesting. He's making certain basic assumptions about where, basic needs are satisfied, and in which we veer off into this, bizarre consumer society. And so he himself is setting a standard, when have you had enough to eat? And he's, setting a standard of the good life, which is basically this leisure class almost, which has nothing to do with money, but has to do with self-cultivation.
The new class, as he calls it, which we should talk about a little bit.
Yeah, so he's making certain assumptions himself about what people need. But of course, need, what is normal human need and what you need to be happy and content and satisfied is a very subjective thing. And the reason I was thinking about this just now is you were talking about dry ice. And not to get personal, but I grew up in a house without air conditioning because my father didn't want to knock down the old walls. So I'm not used to air conditioning, and I hardly ever use it in the summer. And I walk around my living room with very few clothes, and I'm quite comfortable, and I enjoy the heat. And of course...
Don't give your address out.
Of course, most people in Washington think when it's 90 degrees and I'm walking around happily, they can say if their air conditioner breaks down or they don't have air conditioning in their building, it's considered that they're being deprived of one of the basic necessities of life. And you read in the paper about people who don't have air conditioning. So to me, that's quite, I have it, I just don't like it. To me, that's quite decadent, that they need the air conditioning. I see that as the affluent society, that people can't open their windows and walk around,
Well,
so you see, there are certain subjective things when you decide when your basic needs are met.
Sure.
Because people, and he is making certain assumptions himself about human nature and about what makes human nature happy, that you need certain basic needs, and then you need education and cultivation and self-fulfillment. Now, that's his vision of human nature, which I like, but I
in the affluent society, I think he doesn't make. I think he makes an argument that
in the affluent society,
human beings are historical construction. I think he's an heir of the Marxist historical materialist tradition. That he's saying that these needs come into being. I mean, there is the kind of long history of human privation that he acknowledges, that there's this modern liberalism idea, capitalism affects us in a certain way, and then in the affluent society there are certain things that we may actually consider decadent. On page 249 here in this in the 40th anniversary one. Now importantly, he's talking about work here, not just sort of leisure, but it is in the chapter on labor, leisure, and the new class. For others, work, as it continues to be called, and maybe we should talk about whether we're workers or not. Going back to Richard Sennett's point about the new work in the new capitalism, work, as it is continues to be so called, is an entirely different matter. It is taken for granted that it will be enjoyable. I mean, don't we all want to enjoy our work in the coal mine and the factory and the widget plant?
Well, this is a
That's the
myth
growth
of our...
it's the growth of professionalism, and you know.
It is not. If it is not enjoyable, this is a legitimate source of dissatisfaction, even frustration. We wouldn't think a second thought if someone said, "I'm quitting my job because I don't find it self-actualizing." No one regards it as remarkable that even the advertising man, the tycoon, the poet, or the professor who suddenly finds his work unrewarding should seek the counsel of a psychiatrist. I mean, even those people who are traumatized by not having air conditioning in their youth, we would understand. They might, have this real negative energy toward their fellow man. So, I mean...
empirical evidence abounds, though, of things that we don't need. I mean, I used to, when I would teach, would ask my students to talk about new products that had been generated since they were in the course of their long lives. And I mean, things like static cling, even a couple of things that, those sprays that help you, clothing, yeah. Even some of the things we have in politics and prose, I dare say, like magnetic poetry, or, these things are, by anyone's standard, I think, pretty inessential.
Unless I'm mistaken, he was actually writing at the same time as Vance Packard.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of that Vance Packard in here. The engineered consent.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that you've raised are pretty, clearly sort of luxury items, but basic things like, quote, a dishwasher, washing machine.
Mm-hmm.
Do we really absolutely need them? Of course they
Yes.
need life.
Absolutely.
A washing machine, maybe. Do we really need dishwashers?
Well, as technology advances, obviously,
I have a more general question, not just about Galbraith, but why is it that it seems like all the political pressure for redistribution seems to be coming from academics with making six-figure salaries? It doesn't really seem to be...
Wait a minute. Yes, yeah, academics don't, I can assure you,
There aren't
they
people
don't.
on, this isn't exactly like 18th century France. There are not
including the
people
decimal
on...
point.
Okay, wait a minute.
Rabble seems to be hard to rouse.
Well, okay, and I think he would argue that we live...
a rabble anymore. Most people are well off.
That's not
However,
No, that's not true. How can you say that in
That's
D.C.?
not true.
Well,
In any big
that's
city.
one of that's what he says, that most of the reason, people our politicians are not playing to the masses anymore because there aren't that many. The masses,
that's what he says in the chapter on poverty.
The masses are pretty well off. And I still, there are pockets, that's what he's saying. He said, yes, there are pockets of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And there are
There are
what he calls the
extremes,
case studies and the pockets of poverty.
The insular.
Yes. But what he's saying is that inequality is no longer a big issue because most people have their basic needs satisfied. And there's people who are holding food stamps. They have televisions and VCRs. There isn't that much poverty.
He does incidentally
It's not
make...
an issue anymore.
He does make a point that's sort of parallel to what we were saying about academics. It's on page 81 in the new edition. It says, restraints on competition and the free movement of prices, the greatest source of uncertainty to business firms, has been principally deplored by university professors on lifetime appointments.
Well, they're the
It's
only
not quite the
ones
same.
who
I
have
think they've changed since
who have the safety to speak out, perhaps the awareness and the safety to speak out. And
Good point.
we also have to be continually aware whether his audience is those of us at this table or whoever. Remember the low voter turnout that we have.
He does.
And
he
it's
does.
getting lower.
Well, he does, in fact, go on, and one can only guess whether this is tongue-in-cheek, to say their security of tenure is deemed essential for fruitful and unremitting thought.
Well, let's talk about work for a second. I think it's relevant because I think we could sort of have a great conversation about how consumer desire is created in us, both sort of historically and what we deem essential and so forth. And we would never actually be able to come to any agreement about that. And that's an interesting fact of our lives, that one of the major productive activities of our culture is to produce that desire in us. And we are in the thrall of that, whether we like it or not. But let's think about labor and what we do. I don't know if you mentioned you have some thoughts about the labor issue. I guess maybe to do it personally, like are we workers of this new class? What do we labor on exactly? I don't know if anyone wants to address that specifically.
generally, I think what he's talking about is people producing goods, and then the people, the academicians, talking about the people who produce goods and should they produce them faster. But that, I mean, given the dismal science it's due, certain things have to be abstracted and compared.
Sure.
But in terms of reality of our goals for our society and what we, you know, are we going to have any air to breathe while we come out of our air-conditioned houses, which I don't use air conditioning either. So it's, and
That's
it's an
become the litmus
interesting,
test.
yes, it's a litmus test for those of us with courage.
Yeah. Are you not going to be here in the summer?
Right. But what's interesting, though, is what the words seem to have less and less meaning. And because when everyone is for education, all the politicians at
Right.
every level, whether they're running for county commissioner or president, everyone is for education. And all the children are going to be doctors and lawyers. No one is going to have the satisfaction of building a table or drive the bus. We're all going to have
Working in
those
a
Dick
bookstore.
Tracy things because to zoom us around, because there's no one's going to drive the bus or the subway or anything. They're all going to be doctors and lawyers, you should pardon the expression. So you know what the real goals are.
I think in
becomes more hidden.
the area here that there's a language shift that has gone on. When you talk about production, I've been watching the use of the term product around what we used to call services and packages of services, and even the customer satisfaction is a product. It's even
Correct.
crept into
Loans are
government
products.
Loans are products. Government services.
Knowledge is a
the
product.
reinvented government are, you know, offers products to its stakeholders. Well, a stakeholder is the guy you used to regulate the hell out of, but now he's a stakeholder and he gets a product instead. I mean, there is a shift here, and I'm not sure it's illegitimate. I mean, what do you call a person who, you know, massages the keyboard all day in honor of producing a service, what we used to call a service, for somebody that wants to pay for it? I call
Alienated
them a
labor.
worker. I call them
Oh, yeah, alienated labor.
Right.
yeah, well, we could call them that too. Yeah.
And Senate, you know, who addressed this last time, that kind of work produces different kinds of sort of emotional inner lives for the people who do it.
And value.
But let's, I mean, one reason I emphasize the work is because one thing he says is that as all politicians are for education, they're all for producing more jobs. And one of the things that Galbraith says is that maybe we should get our heads around the fact that we don't need to produce more jobs, that we need to figure out how to have fewer jobs, getting people out of the economy, the young people, the old people, shorter work weeks, different kinds of production schedules. I don't know, what do you, I mean...
Isn't that happening of its own accord?
Well, but I mean...
Age discrimination, yeah.
No, exactly, and maybe it is happening, you know, despite ourselves.
Yeah, it is.
I think, you know, I mean, the two things I think he says to me that were most salient in our work is I think he's talking about a basic shift in work. Number one was the fact that there are more of these people producing, you know, in the new class who are doing sort of intellectually satisfying work, even if they don't always stay exactly within their caste and they're on the fringes,
Right.
that this is expanding. The other thing I think that he says is very important, which accounts for why we need, I mean, one of the reasons why we don't need everybody to work, is he sees the nature of work having changed, that, you know, going back again to Ricardo, most work was very, you know,
Labor intensive.
labor intensive, and everybody was doing the same thing. So, you know, everybody was at sort of an equal skill level is the way he portrays it. And now he says things have changed, and that the 5% that's left over, that's unemployed, it's not because they're just an anonymous 5% that's left over. It's because they are the young, the stupid, forgive me, the black, all right? He says that, okay?
Does he say that?
Yes, he says that, you know. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be politically correct. He says, and the people who are not as well, I mean, as well qualified, and they are the reason they are left out, and that they are not really, they're not skilled and they're not productive, you see? And it's because I think in some ways he sees the nature of work itself, number one, as becoming this broadening of this intellectual class, and also the fact that work has become perhaps more
Expertise
more
and narrowing.
expertise.
Yeah.
And the people who are left out, it's not just the last 5% who came to the market, it's a 5% that cannot do the work. And we are better off just giving them an income so they don't go in there and just let up the market.
I think there's something missing from the overall, from our discussion and from the book as well, and that is a realization that it's one thing to have an affluent society, that is a society which is, at least in principle, capable of meeting all its material needs in isolation. It's another thing altogether to have it embedded in a planet where the same statement cannot be made, and moreover, embedded in a planet where its economic relationships with the other people on that planet are key to its ability to produce all this wealth. So it isn't really as though the GDP is simply large enough that if we distributed it homogeneously or something like that, everybody would have much more than they need. That wouldn't, depending on who you take to be
You mean
everybody.
on a global
I
basis?
don't think he wants to distribute equally. He wants to give people enough.
That's not my point.
He wants to give them enough to live on so they don't have to work because they're not productive anyway.
Either way, what I'm saying is you couldn't come close to achieving either of those goals on a global basis.
Well, let's come back to that in a second. You were going to say.
Thank you. A little bit shy. We're not good at jumping in, I guess. One thing I was really interested in is my background is in the nonprofit sector, which is kind of between these like public kind of stuff and like private kind of production of goods. It's somewhere sort of between the two. And, you know, although, I mean, this affluent society might indicate that there's just a lack of work for people of the, you know, sort of more educated classes, whatever, actually, you can also look at it like, kind of like what you were saying, that there's just like a lot of work for, you know, that class of people, and what they should be doing is kind of getting in there and selling, you know, creating their own sort of organizations to sell, you know, the public goods, you know, both sort of nationally and globally, as you mentioned, which I don't think is in here.
I think Gabriel would agree. I mean, part of his thing is that
yeah.
workers, our notion of work, again, languishes in this productive model. He's saying there's plenty of work to be done. You know, streets to be cleaned up, you know, parks and ecological.
I think he confines it to just like, you know, I don't think he leaves room for, or even, I don't know, elucidates that
Right.
other, you know, possibility. The other sector is very much like there's private, and then there's
Right. And to your point, he does say in his introduction, I mean, and I think he does acknowledge the persistence and entrenched racism of the culture. He's saying that is part of the problem here. So I'm just, that's to address one point there. But your point that he does say in his introduction to the 40th edition that mass deprivation remains the most shocking aberration of modern times, both globally and in these so-called affluent societies. You know, the many who live short, misery-dominated lives in lands of abject poverty. A companion volume, the non-affluent society, would have had a yet more urgent
Well,
message.
my point was more fundamental. I wasn't simply looking for an acknowledgement from him that this larger problem exists. What I was saying is I think to some degree it undermines the framework within which the whole analysis takes place. If, for example, you believe, as Lester Thoreau has been saying for the last couple of years, I mean also an economist from the same end of the political spectrum as Galbraith, that if you have third world skills, you're going to get third world wages, irrespective of where you live, if that's in the United States or someplace else. Hence, whether you recognize it or not, you are competing with somebody from Bangladesh. You are competing with somebody from a lot of other cultures, and you cannot, it just doesn't seem to me like you can proceed very far in an analysis which seems fundamentally to assume that there's enough stuff to take care of everybody.
And not to disagree with you, I would just offer as somewhat of a rebuttal that Galbraith perhaps would propose that you are still in the thrall of the sort of Ricardo Malthus model, that in fact that contemporary capitalism could solve the problem of scarcity globally if we were to allow it. That in fact the sort of
that the aggregate global GDP is sufficient to take care of the aggregate global population.
But perhaps not measured in GDP. Some you know, the productive model is capable now of sort of satisfying, producing the affluent society for human beings as such. So I think, I mean, I understand your point, and you know, the World Watch Institute has, you know, there is that kind of Malthusian sensibility that lurks behind it, like, well, eventually, you know, we're going to reach population X, and the revolution is going to jump off, or you know, fascism is going to emerge, and you know, we can't do that. I think Galbraith would say that part of your argument is ideological rather than sort of, as you're casting it as sort of an empirical one. You were about to say.
Yeah, one thing I was saying, because you brought up Senate a few times, and the one thing that does, to tie the two, or to compare the two books a little bit, is, he has essential philosophical difference in Senate. Senate, one of the things, the themes of Senate was the fact that our work is basically our narrative, our purpose, that it's a real part of our identity. And I think one way in which Galbraith is quite different, and it comes out very in an interesting way, is he doesn't have this idea that our work is our purpose or identity, our narrative.
True,
He says, it's very interesting. He says at one point, he says at one point in the book, and
You are what you eat.
because you have this sitting here, and you brought up Senate a few times,
Right.
and he says, there are many. He doesn't, of course, with the new class, I mean, people they need to work, and they want their work to be satisfying. But he says there are many people who are never going to be productive, who don't have a commitment to work, and that they are better off. This is something that Senate would not say. I mean, the Senate sees a janitor having, if not a great intellectual career, but as something that gives him his life a core and gives him the ability to create a narrative. And Galbraith, I think in some ways it's very interesting, Galbraith, who is an economist, he has sort of a suspicion of this work ethic and this need for people to work. He thinks there are a lot of people who really are better off not working and who can't function well in the workplace.
I agree. I think he doesn't address the critique that Senate makes about our need to have these narratives, these late of our labor.
What we need is to survive.
Okay, well, along those lines, his epigraph I thought was very interesting, was just a quote from Alfred Marshall, that the economist, like everyone else, must concern himself with the ultimate aims of man. But at the end of this book, it wasn't clear to me what Galbraith's understanding of the ultimate aims.
It does kind of peter out, I would agree with you, about the ultimate aims.
What was your sense?
Well, I think he offers some, I think, along the lines of a good modern liberal himself, he sees some reforms as possible. He does see this need for social balance, public expenditure. I think he would agree with you that there are plenty of jobs out there to make our lives better, more humane, more ethical, less driven by sort of perverse production of both consumption and goods that we sure as hell don't need.
Programmatic
No, right.
But well, I mean that.
But you're right. He doesn't point to the ultimate ends of man. I agree with you. But I just enumerate them, so we'll put them on the table. He does have a couple of.
I thought you were going to enumerate the ultimate ends of man.
That's the next
intellectual parenting on.
Right.
And I think one thing to note about his policy recommendations is how far from the political table they are right now. He emphasizes unemployment compensation. There is both with the Democrats under the sort of thrall of the Democratic Leadership Council, personified in Clinton, and the sort of centrist Democrats, and the Republicans of all stripes, that work is necessary, that work is an ethical end, and damn it, man, we are not going to pay anybody to live off the fat of the land. They should get out and get a job. And I mean, I don't know of any politician who would be able to say, let's expand unemployment compensation and get elected. And I said, this is one of his main policy proposals. The other one is this social balance taxation, to put more public goods sort of away from the military expenditures into the kinds of things that you were talking about. I think the Republicans' latest policy agenda is to emphasize the need to rebuild the military once again. And then his other one was increase of sales tax, basically consumer taxes. I don't think any politician could talk about that. You can sort of talk about it with cigarettes now, and sort of like, what are they called? Vice taxes, sin taxes. Yeah. So that's kind of in the air, but even that gets
substance of my life.
I actually have to disagree with
Sure.
you on 2 points.
Sure.
One, I agree with what you said. I think one of his biggest policy recommendations, and one that is being pursued for reasons that more or less correspond to his own arguments, and that's a renewed interest in reforming the education system
Agreed.
and the workforce training system. There is still a struggle at the local level, but it's a different political system, and decisions
Right.
are made in a very different way, even around taxes.
Sure.
So I would think that that is one area where there's room to maneuver, but state and local governments are much more tightly bound. And most of them have to, by law, balance their budgets annually, may be subject to a lot of state and local requirements on how they can spend. But in
Sure.
terms of the sales tax, I think it is increasingly being used in different ways, and states are playing with it in important ways to make sure that money is being funneled back into the education system.
I
A lot
agree.
of it is through state lotteries.
Yeah,
and
that,
kind of
that was
thing.
my point. The
It's
sort of,
ironic.
But one of the interesting tensions, which he doesn't talk about, and this is just because from my work I'm very well familiar with, is that there is a tension on the ground between job creation and paying for job creation at the state and local level, and the fact that a lot of that money comes through things like tax incentives, which takes the money out of the education system into the job creation delivery system. And that, he doesn't even get to that, but that's
Right.
a real tension in his argument.
Right.
But that's what gets the point, which is why sales tax is a
Right.
better alternative.
oh, I agree with you. I just, and the only thing I would just offer in response is that I think as taxes, sort of taxes have become ideologically dismissed, you have to use other kinds of euphemisms. On sales tax, you're able to, I think, to use things like sin tax or whatever to tax it. And I agree that the model of revenue production through
voluntary
lotteries, and regressive forms of regressive taxation, and ipso facto taxation are more prevalent, as at least overt politics, than sort of an open discussion about using sales tax as a way to increase revenue. And the only other thing is that I agree with you. Every politician loves education, and we all would probably agree that it's important, but there's a huge debate over what that means. Does it mean vouchers? Does it mean the sort of evisceration of a public system? Does it mean education for all? Does it mean education only for elite?
They, meaning the politicians, generally, and especially those running for office, use it as if it's a blanket. Well, if I say education, you're all going to wake up smart tomorrow morning and know how to and pass your spelling test, which they probably don't even give anymore. But
Spell check, why bother?
we get, because the words can be misused, as you know. But
I know.
there are so many different influences in our society now that he couldn't possibly touch on them in one book, as person to my left was just saying about different kinds of taxes, and without, because we're on television, without mentioning the corporation, but we all know
Names. Go ahead.
that just I think were succeeded in playing poker with the governor of the state to our north, and they won. And they won money from the education system and everything else, whether it's sweeping the streets or whatever, because they just lost a big poker game, and to the tune of, what was it? It was 200 million, 300 million. Just use round numbers,
Just marry it.
and it's just outrageous. And there are things that the most sophisticated economist of 10 years ago couldn't have dreamed of or think would happen in a model.
This is also written pre-Great Society, which nationalized a lot of things,
Right.
which began devolving again, speaking to your...
And just to mention the point earlier about inflation, I think I think economists, or at least the sort of official Mandarin economists, are really confused. Why are we having unprecedentedly low levels of unemployment, and why is inflation not sort of skyrocketing? Yeah. So I think
all the verities of the past are no longer applied.
well, but I think it's an interesting time. I think that no one is really knowing what's going on. Why has the Dow reached 10,000? Why do we have this expansion that seems to have broken out of the business cycle, the boom and bust? Why is unemployment, even if the employment is, like Richard Sennett says, sort of destroying our humanity in a way? No one's arguing that we aren't producing jobs. And why isn't inflation going up?
Because this time is different.
Which, okay.
We'll see.
Well, I think, you know, I think it raises some interesting questions about where we are going, and from Galbraith's argument, you know, what is it, if we have achieved these things, and we could all have paranoid visions that they're not going to last and so forth, but if we have achieved them even now, why can't we talk about these other kinds of goods, maybe other ends for our society?
You don't think those things have been talked about, maybe not by all parts of the political spectrum, but I think those other kinds of goods, people have been talking about.
Oh, I agree. I agree.
And I mean, there are, you may feel like that they're being purely cynical, but there are people who address the questions about unemployment insurance and being opposed to it. And
I
you can
agree.
say it's it's purely for their vested interest economic, but people like I forget his name, but he wrote the history of social charities in the United States.
Katz, Michael Katz. But I guess my point is that at the sort of level of political discourse that dominates our national and many state and local levels of government, the kind of open conversation about social goods that might be produced.
What social goods do you feel like there has not been a conversation of?
Well, I would argue that we still are in the thrall of the production model, that politicians want to produce more jobs, to produce more goods, and they see that as a necessary end.
As opposed to some coherent debate about distribution of the wealth that already exists.
Or certain kinds of public expenditures,
Same thing.
you know.
Right.
Like daycare for everybody.
Daycare for everybody,
But
yeah.
then that's not necessarily, I mean, that's not a value that's not being discussed. That's a particular remedy you have in mind that you would like to be considered, but that doesn't, I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding what
No, I
you're
think Michael's
suggesting.
right. I think that, I don't know how we would gauge this, but I mean, objectively, but I think that discussion by and large still does not take place. And perhaps some of the reason that it doesn't take place is because people are not yet convinced that we've arrived,
Sure.
or that we've arrived, and it may or may not be paranoid, but certainly the debate is not taking place.
Right.
But if it
So
were,
there's certain things you want to see be put on the table and discussed, but those are remedies, those aren't what... But
No,
he was
no,
suggesting
they're
it's
more
a
than
product in a
remedies.
way, isn't
That
it?
simply means.
I mean, daycare for everybody is a product. If it were discussed and we decided we wanted that product, what are we going to do about getting it?
Well, no, again, what I'm saying, what value, when you talk about daycare, mandatory daycare for everyone, what value?
Not
You feel-
mandatory, but
Well-
availability
Well,
is quite different.
I think Galbraith talks about the distinction, sort of taking in the modern liberal, away from the modern liberal, the end of equality, and talk about social balance. His language is social balance. That if we could get our heads around this notion of affluence and post-scarcity, that we wouldn't try and get into these traditional debates between liberals and conservatives about how much to tax the rich, but some other kind of model of redistribution that's about social balance, the public investment versus some sort of private investment for production. I think that's in an economic language that may not be satisfying to you. I mean, I think I hear what you're sort of pushing for.
No, I guess, well, there were some people who would be violently opposed to the government providing daycare for their children. That would be something
I
they
would say
want.
majority of people, that's why, or maybe because of
And
low voter turnout, we don't know.
And not for economic reasons, necessarily.
Well, I don't think we're presupposing what the result of the discussion would be, and that seems to be what's disturbing you. I think
Right.
the issue, or at least as I understand the issue, is whether or not such a discussion is taking place at all. Whether we have moved to a point where we might say, let's assume that we have, like GDP, that we have some measure of material well-being that was demonstrably sufficient to take care of the material needs of everybody within some sector of the global economy. Then what would we do about it? Then would we simply continue to invest and distribute it in the way that we're doing right now, or are there ends which are in fact not being addressed at all? It doesn't presuppose what those ends are going to be or the means to achieve them, but the dialogue isn't taking place.
Exactly, I agree. The dialogue is not taking place because, unfortunately, the people who succeed in becoming elected are beholden to a very small group of people who pull their strings, and most of the
voters.
people don't vote and don't notice. They're not being pulled by the strings of the voters. They're being pulled by the strings of the people who back them financially. And these people don't have any, and these people in power, by and large, the majority of them, they're always the good guys struggling there. And the women now in the Congress and in the Senate have had a great influence, but it's very slow.
And of course,
disagree with you on one point.
and of course,
Will
there
Rogers
is the
said,
politics and prose.
You get the your representative serves you right.
Right.
Of
You
course
get
there-
the representative you deserve.
Mm.
Well, I don't disagree with his cynicism and correctitude, but it's getting worse because more and more people are not voting, and they lower the age to 18, and so now people aren't voting. From the majority of people 18 to 21 are not voting.
Of course, the counter argument is that people are satisfied. That's why they're not voting.
Or dissatisfied,
true.
and
I mean,
cynical
I'm just
don't
saying-
think it'll make any difference.
But
Tough to demonstrate one way or
either.
the other.
So, but of course, as I was going to say, that there is the politics and prose public affairs reading group, which of course will be the cell of the new society. Provocation.
Well, and there are plenty of societies where these questions have been
Are you going to
asked.
hand us out our 10 Commandments
Yes.
right
No,
now,
no.
sir?
Daycare is a particularly good
Yeah,
example.
we'll have
Well,
daycare for everyone. So
I
let-
think
I,
one may care for everyone. He wouldn't think it was so important for a welfare mother to work. A mother who had children, he would say, why does she have to work? I mean, the whole,
right.
I doubt
he would,
Well-
no, that was
Right, but how about care for
Maybe
the
she could go
elderly
to-
then? Something
she could
that's
go to
not-
art classes.
I don't know if it was the
say
best
she should stay
example.
home and take care of her children. It's not so important. She should
No,
go out
but
and work.
let's put that one aside. How about care for the elderly? The elderly have to be taken care of somehow.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So is that discussion really on the table as to how we're going to really do that? I mean, it's still, the care for the elderly in this country is still largely dependent on women volunteering their labor.
Well, it's a
Being
Even
underpaid as
families or-
employees.
yeah.
And
But it's usually the woman in the family who does it.
Absolutely right.
It doesn't even really matter if he would agree with the argument. Now that I'm thinking about it, whether daycare for women is a good idea or not, but it really, nobody, he says something here about the idea of raising the idea of whether a school is good for the community. Whether we should have a school can actually be a really radical idea, just proposing that, and the same thing, whether we should have like universal daycare available. You just can't really even raise that on an equal plane with anything else.
Well, it's about quarter of, and the point of Gail Braith, as with Senate's book last month, was at least to try and have the provocations to ask these questions, that to get us to think about them. I think whether Gail Braith is courageous or not, I do think it is a provocation to our present vacuous political debate, and that it can sort of help maybe us sort of push it forward. So next month, we're going to do The Secret Lives of Citizens, Pursuing the Promise of American Life, Thomas Gohagen. It's got some stuff about D.C. in here, sort of memoir, political critique, provocation to think about what it would mean to be an engaged citizen. I think a fascinating read, sort of along the lines of many of our discussions over the last several months. I will look forward to hearing from all of you on it. If you purchase the book here at Politics and Prose, mention that you're in the Public Affairs group, and since it's a hardback, you can have 30% off of it, okay?
Is it in stock now?
There are some upstairs. Yeah, I'm not sure how many. I'm going to order more, okay? I think after that, I was going to do, so this will be for April, the fourth Monday in April. I'm still deciding on May. I wanted to, partly because of Gail Braith, partly